All right. George Kilpatrick, Inspiration for the Nation, celebrating people we feel good about. Paula Johnson is a professor of law at Syracuse University, the co-founder and co-director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative. And Paula, you just were appointed to something recently as part of the Judicial Commission. Explain what that appointment is.
Yes. Hi, George. Thank you for having me back on the show. These are always important discussions that we have. Yes, I've been appointed to the Franklin H. Williams Judicial Commission. That is a commission in New York State that has the a mandate or a role to ensure that there is racial and ethnic fairness throughout the court systems of New York. And that includes litigants, it includes attorneys, it includes those who work for the court, it includes members of the bench and the bar. And so the goal is to make sure that there is equitable, fair treatment for all persons having any business with the court system in New York. And so I'm a commissioner, and that work takes place statewide with programming, educational and informational, all mentoring, various, pipeline programs, various types of endeavors along those lines.
Well, certainly, Professor Johnson, and thank you for letting me call you Paula, just so people know I'm not, not giving the sister her honorific.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
But I'm so proud. I just want to say that I'm so proud of the work that you do in ensuring the rights that we have fairness in a variety of arenas, LGBTQ rights, civil rights. Obviously, that work is very important, and we find ourselves once again, Professor Johnson, in times such as this. Our conversation today is about the death of Tyre Nichols at the hands of 5 Memphis police officers who were part of the now disbanded Scorpion unit. The beating caught on tape, the full video finally released by authorities in Memphis, Tennessee. And so what did we witness here? This was a traffic stop, and I'll let you do the rest of the breakdown of this, but this was a traffic stop that ended in the death of yet another Black man. So well, George, I know that, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, let me not interrupt you, but so let me answer that question by saying the 2 things. One is to discuss what we witnessed and to also discuss what we did not witness.
Go ahead.
And I think that both of those things are very important for us to understand what happened in this situation. And George, and I'm going to use the familiar too, because we have that kind of connection. But George, I want to say your work is so important to bringing information to our communities, locally, nationally, and I want to thank you for that. So this opportunity is important for us to have this discussion. So here, with respect to Tyre Nichols, what we saw was, I think, the most abject experience of brutality, inhumanity, and torture of a human being that one could ever expect to witness. One would never want to see something like that in their lifetimes, much less, of course, to have experienced it. And I want to say from the outset too, with such a heavy heart, to the family of Tyre Nichols, how much sorrow and condolences I send to them, just on a very basic human level, for them to have had this occur to their son, he was the father of a child, so to their father, to a member of the community. Apparently, he was highly, regarded in the skateboarding community, among other things. He was a photographer, so he was a creative person. He was somebody, in our society, in our world, who meant something to many people. And now, because his life was cut short by these officers, he means something to us in a very different respect. And we're going to have to, as a community and as a society, we're going to have to hold him up. And we're going to have to hold up his family and his community, because what happened to him should not have happened to any human being. And to say that there was, some basis, which is yet to be established. I've been looking for the substantiation of a reason for the traffic stop. I've yet to see it. But all of that aside, even if there were a reason for him to have been stopped,
starting with that,
what
right?
subsequently ensued from what we saw in this brutal, grotesque beating that these 5 officers meted out on his young, slender body is something that is just ghastly, frankly. And then here is the part of what we did not see.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't see any humanity extended to this young man. We saw nothing. And I watched the videos. I watched the different installments of the videos, and each time I looked for some instance where somebody in that gang of officers would intervene and say, stop, right? Stop. Enough. We've made our point. We've brutalized him enough. No one extended. I saw no one extend anything. And what makes it even more egregious to me and heartless, frankly, is that what we did see amongst those officers, now former officers, was that when they, errantly sprayed themselves with the pepper spray, you saw them react to each other immediately. Right, they're pouring water over their eyes and faces so that the effects of the pepper spray, don't have a lasting impact. I mean, these irritants, are awful, and they can harm people in lasting ways. But certainly immediately they have a terrible impact. People can't breathe, they can't see. So they responded to their own needs immediately, but they didn't take a moment to see what they could do to help this helpless young man, made helpless by their own actions. So those are the things that we were witnessing being depicted in these videos.
Yeah, and certainly those 5 officers were fired. The DA has brought murder charges. We also found that there were other law enforcement that was nearby that did nothing. After, first of all, the brutality of what we witnessed on that video, the standing him up and then punching him and kicking him, and then leaving him in the car without any being attended to, as you so aptly pointed out. And then I guess so there's now a couple of sheriffs that have been sheriff's deputies that have been will be reprimanded, or at least being looked at.
But this is the point too, George. To that, when the EMTs, when the ambulance finally came,
that's the other piece.
They did not act immediately.
Exactly.
This is beyond imagination. Now let's just put the officers to the side for the moment. But once medical personnel arrived on the scene, it's unfathomable that they would not have taken immediate action because they had to have seen the condition that he was in. What could have accounted for the fact that they did not take any action to immediately meet his medical needs? So all of these people who were on the scene bear some responsibility, and I would say all of that responsibility is criminal responsibility. There will be something that will happen in the criminal courts. It should happen in the civil courts as well. They all bear some responsibility and should be held accountable either for what they did in a positive, active way, but also for what they did not do in a passive or failure to act way when they had the obligation to make sure that, one, they didn't brutalize him as they did, and two, that upon having seen that, having done that, that they rendered absolutely no aid to him.
Professor Paula Johnson is joining us, Syracuse University College of Law, talking about the brutal beating of Tyre Nichols and its impact. It's resonating. Protests all across this country, protests across many different communities in Memphis, Tennessee, et cetera. I remember when this first came out, and the 5 officers, and let's now name that they were all Black officers, right? Yes. Somebody posted on Twitter the faces of white supremacy, these 5 Black officers. And that confused a lot of people, but I'm sure it's not confusing to you, because so would you help people who are confused by that, what that signifying? Because, and this is someone else wrote something about, so let me start with that. Why those officers are the faces of white supremacy?
So the connection that is being made by posting that image and that ideology is to make the point that it isn't about the race of the officers. It is about the race of the victim. So that Tyre, as a Black man who is seen to be automatically, almost inherently, criminal just because of who he is in this Black body, is something that is part of the racial hierarchy within a system of justice that devalues Black and brown bodies. And that doesn't matter so much as to who's doing the brutalization in terms of the racial background of the officers. It's the systemic nature of the way in which policing is done within this society. And that says that Black and brown people, men and women, will be considered to be unworthy, not innocent, and not deserving of any of the types of protections that this system is supposed to be built on. So the institutionalized nature of racism takes place no matter who the participants are. And that's the point that's being made.
Yeah, I mean, and does it hurt? Is it more deeply felt because these officers are Black, or do we say no, they are as much victims of the system as you just described as if they weren't Black?
Well, I'm going to put their victimhood aside for the moment because they made certain choices, and among the choices that they
wait a minute, did it sound like I was making them victims?
No.
Okay.
No, absolutely not. No, I'm just.
I would make that clear. Oh no, yeah.
No, not attributing that thought to you. What I'm saying is, it is conceivable that someone could say they too are victims of
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
racialized
Hmm.
system. And so my point is to put them to the side for the moment, because the determining factors again have to do with how we regard Black and brown people within the system. And so it's very clear that someone in Tyre Nichols' position is viewed as less than within an institutionalized and hierarchical, racially hierarchical viewpoint. Now, so your question, to get back to that directly, was, is there some say deeper reaction or response to the fact that these 5 officers were Black? And I would say, to speak, personally, yes, yes. And it's not to sentimentalize it, but just to say that for many people of color who go into law enforcement, they go in because they want there to be a responsiveness to the needs of communities of color. But if they act in such a way that isn't in any way, different from the existing structure, then they too will view Black and brown bodies in the same ways. They treated this man as though he were an inanimate object, not a human being at all. And so it's disappointing. I'll put it this way. It's extremely disappointing that they could see nothing of themselves in him, or people who looked like them in him. Whatever the purpose was, whether it was actual or whether it was pretextual for them to have stopped him in the first place, that their role and responsibility was to follow the legal procedures for bringing someone in. They should have explained to him why he was being stopped. None of those things happened. And so it is more egregious in that way to me, because they had an opportunity to treat him with decency and respect, even if the overarching system told them not to do that. And so, their agency was exercised in such a way that also, deprived, this young man of his humanity based on all factors, based on race, just based on his fundamental humanity.
Professor Paula Johnson from the Syracuse University College of Law joining us. Also joining the conversation is Eliot Boyce, Black law enforcement officer with the state police, retired state police officer. The condemnation obviously has come from all over the country, including those in law enforcement and including the Memphis chief of police. Eliot, what's your take on this and the fact that these are Black officers that are named in this horrific crime?
George, I appreciate you having me on. Doctor, it was a pleasure listening to the commentary that you just provided. I would tell you, and I've always said it, you go back in the roles, George, from the last time we spoke, I've said the most dangerous police officer is the unconscious Black police officer, the one who co-signs to behavior that may be minor in the sense of laughing at an extra hit, laughing at a off-colored comment instead of correction, or basically staying neutral to it. So with that being said, in this particular case, I will be honest, I cannot and could not watch the whole video. Here's another case of, we've talked about this in the past too. There's a man, someone's son, someone's community person who's now deceased over a vehicle and traffic stop, where the most the police officer could do is issue a citation. It's not to the level of offering up, taking them to jail. So whatever went wrong there was out of the norm, out of the institutional guidelines of any police agency. The police chief, who is a solid sister, those who may not know the background, she's a member of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives. She will be the national president moving forward in the years to come. So we're talking about changing the institutional process or problem that, for whatever reason, these officers, regardless of color, is just more disturbing that they are Black. You know, at the end of the day, police officers are supposed to be police officers regardless of color and treat people with dignity. This clearly did not happen. So when you talk about police officers, we say it all the time, the good police officers we want, the bad ones get out. And these individuals are heading to jail where they should be.
And here's the other piece that's come up, and I'd love the two of you to respond to this. In the other instance where there was some case of officer misconduct and the officer was Black, I'm thinking about the case in Minnesota, which involved a white female, that seemed to move very quickly. But and what a lot of Black folk are talking about across this country is what Tyre Nichols' own parents said. He says, I hope we now have a blueprint for the way this should work in this country, because it didn't take months or weeks or even years to prosecute. This was, the charges were brought, they were fired immediately, the DA brought charges, and now the DOJ, the Department of Justice, is looking at this. What Black folk are saying is, this is very quick. And is it because, and again, not to, because I think you were right, Pastor, I'm going to call you Pastor Johnson, Professor Johnson, you were right to say that we don't want to assign any victimhood to these brothers, because what they did, they should pay for and pay for mightily. At the same time, do we only see justice in law enforcement when the officers are Black? Because go ahead, Professor Johnson.
Yes, yeah, George. So I understand that point. I understand that point entirely. I think we're capable of understanding that there are nuances and many dimensions, to this issue. And I would say that this is the way in which institutional racism works. And that is, there will be one impact in terms of the treatment of Tyre Nichols, and this is not to be, sympathetic, at all to these officers, but the way in which the racial hierarchy works is that, when there is condemnation within that system, they will be the first to come before it and to be, charged. Their cases will be handled, more swiftly, because of their race. I mean, this is the irony or the paradox of the situation, is that they would do the bidding under a racist system, and they will fall victim and prey to that same system because of what they have done. And so the way in which it is a reinforcing narrative as it relates to the racial dimensions of this. And so now they're going to find themselves on, the end of this, where they're going to be, the prey to a system in which, other Black and brown people are victimized.
I will extend it a little further, George, just one step further. When you talk about Black males, police officers, and females, because what I've seen is when it's a swift action to justice, it involves those two. Unfortunately, for years, African Americans have been deaf against becoming police officers, so the industry has remained predominantly white males. And as that change has begun, the change as far as diversity within these agencies has become the white female. And what we've seen over the years is now, of recent, a lot of Black females, of course, they're qualified and have the ability and the education and skill set, are now leading a lot of the police agencies. Problem on them is the support that they should have from the Black males in many police agencies. And you know what? We don't condone all Black officers, but those who are Black male officers in many of these agencies are not doing anything to support them. And the actions of these officers show no support or respect for their chief, who's a solid person. But when you talk about rush to send these males to jail, I've received the same phone calls. You know, is it the proper blueprint? Yeah. If it's that bad, if it was a regular, normal citizen, yes, they should go to jail. And no one's condoning that. But what we will say is, in the institution and law enforcement, in many cases, friends protect friends. When it comes to that, when you start talking about these other instances where white officers are involved, where someone is basically killed a man on national TV, and someone could go out there and say, well, you know, he resisted. And then you give the backdrop that a counterfeit bill in most cases don't even get prosecuted. They get secured and turned over to the federal agency in charge. So, you know, when we talk about this rush to judgment, should it be the blueprint? Yes, but it should be the blueprint for everybody.
Right.
But what I'm seeing is, I'm seeing people getting political ground off of this, and that's disturbing. Actually, a better word, disgusting. You know, have individuals that are saying, you know, this is done properly. I'm appalled by the way this has been handled. Well, where was that letter last year? Where were those statements in support last year? Now, some people stood out on the ledge, but a lot of people stood on the tree trunk. So when we talk about it, should it be the blueprint for bad police officers? And I will tell you, I have a lot of officers, particularly white male officers, that I will go to war with every day. I have some Black officers I wouldn't walk across the street with. So that's just a fact. And
there's some Black officers you would go to war with every day too. Let's not make it all.
Correct. I said some.
Right.
There many Black officers I definitely go to war with. There's some solid individuals.
Right.
But I think race jumps into it, and we start to think, because the burden and the institution of policing has been dominated by white males, that there's this thing against white males in agencies. Not true, because there's some very good white officers operating.
But Eliot, isn't the idea of having more officers of color in the agency to prevent the very thing that just happened to Tyre Nichols, right? I'm supposed to see you as being human, and I'm supposed to treat you as such. This idea of and that Black Lives Matter. In other words, these officers discarded him as much as the system did. And I'm saying, isn't that what we've been fighting for as a community, to make our law enforcement more reflective and representative? And then from that would mean a more humane treatment.
Yes. Just unfortunately is we have this thing that I call the moving on up. You know, many of the officers, if you do backgrounds on them or you really get into them, are not from the cities or areas in which they're patrolling. So there's no connection to it. And if you grew up in the suburbs, if you grew up in an area in which you don't identify with being Black, or you have no desire to, because once you get into the system of law enforcement, it becomes Fox News instead of CNN, right? And if that's what your mindset is, that you're not connected to those communities, you don't see the value in that young man. You know, you become disconnected. And then again, we also have to talk about the fact that police officers are dealing with a lot of things, you know, so their ability to disconnect from whatever they're managed over the years that's been untreated and untaken care of through the lack of resources within their agencies contributed to these factors also. And again, not giving them any excuse for their actions. But there are some degrees of trauma in which individuals are dealing with in law enforcement that needs to be taken care of and need to be funded. So the idea we need to get a bigger squad car or a bigger Ram vehicle and not want to provide counseling services to these officers are contributing factors also. So Bottom line is we need just good police officers, regardless where they come from, but more Black officers that are conscious and can relate to the community, go a lot further. So at the end of the day, we just want the best candidate. And if we get someone that's really reflective of the community, we take them first. But that's not what always happens.
Talking to Eliot Boyce,
So I'd
retired
like to add to that
police state officer.
also, to this point, because, I'd like to steer away from the idea of bad apples, as though that were the singular, reason for, why officers such as these would have acted in the way that they did, whatever their race, including the fact that they were Black officers, because we really have to look at the systemic nature of what we're talking about. We have to look at, what is the institution of policing in U.S. society, and why we continue to get these outcomes. It can't just be because of 5 officers, or in the case of George Floyd, the 4 officers who were on the scene there, or the Freddie Gray case where they, put him, in the van and deliberately compounded his injuries. This isn't just about, particular individuals. It's about a system in which it instills in officers a sense that these sorts of things are approved and can be done, and it's part of the training. Now, and so individuals will take advantage of that because they can do so largely with impunity. Now, if we were serious about making a difference, and so that policing were to change in the United States, there would be accountability at every level up and down the chain. The officer on the street up to the officers behind the desk would feel the responsibility for their lack of humane treatment for anyone with whom they came into contact. There would not be the kind of court-sanctioned immunity from prosecution or immunity from civil suits to law enforcement if we were serious about changing the culture and the behavior of the institution of policing in the United States. We can't do this piecemeal. So now it's going to be these 5 officers. And then the next thing will happen, it'll be the next, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 officers. What we need is to look at the system in a comprehensive way to say, what is it about policing in the United States that these kinds of things continue to happen? We have not passed the George Floyd Policing Act after the horrors of watching what happened to him. There was a flurry of activity. There are suggestions on the table. They're before Congress. Many states have some similar provisions. These things aren't being passed. What kind of policing would find that it is acceptable to hold a person in a chokehold? Why isn't it a simple matter of saying that that is not an acceptable practice, right? What kind of policing would say, if you use the kind of excessive force that we saw in the murder of George Floyd, and now the murder of Tyre Nichols, that the officers involved and their departments will not have any immunity from lawsuits if they are found to have been responsible for those acts? That will carry such power and deterrent effect that officers and their superiors would think twice about committing those kinds of acts, if they knew that they would be subject to these kinds of penalties. Now, even having said that, I have to say, it's not clear to me just how effective it will be either, because, right, one of the things that was called for, were the body cameras.
Right.
These officers had body cameras on. Now, there's some discrepancy in terms of, whether they were on all the time,
Right.
at what point they started. We didn't see anything about the initial stop. Now that's curious, and we need to look into that. But even past that point, what we saw was the beating of Mr. Nichols, and they seemed, were quite unabashed about doing that, even with body cameras on. So I'm not saying that it's a panacea, but I am saying that structural change is needed, and we can't just look at individual members of law enforcement without looking at the whole picture in addition to the individual people.
So before you answer that, Eliot, there's a question that came up, and then pull that question into what Professor Johnson just posed. And this is from Vicky saying, during the screening process, are Black officers chosen for the likelihood that they will conform to the status quo or of belief within the ranks of law enforcement versus challenge that system? In other words, if you feel like you can have an impact, and if you then you're not likely to be chosen. So if you're going to conform to the status quo, which leads to situations, which potentially leads to situations like this, would you be chosen? Fold that into your response to Professor Johnson. And by the way, we should be talking to our elected representatives about the George Floyd Act that you talk about, Professor Johnson, because I'm not hearing much about that either. So thank you for reminding us that that's still not passed. Eliot.
Yeah. The institution of policing, and you talking about immunity and police officers acting and changing, it's a long-standing institution that requires change. I will tell you, in most agencies that I've impacted and have had the ability to interact with are putting change in and are trying to put levels or layers or things. Look, no police chief wants to wake up, go to bed on Sunday, wake up on Monday and have that on their desk. It's just not something they want. So they, because their job becomes at stake. But what's happening now in this institution, we talk about the question, and having, solid Black males or minorities coming onto the job and possibly getting discarded. Now there's layers that have been put in place to prevent that too. But again, when we have minor things that are weeding people out, that creates an impact far as change. But also when people start thinking about how's that person getting weeded out, or once they get in, why are they changing? It becomes a money thing. And, we talk about money all the time, and it should never be a money issue. But when people start having houses, cars, boats, children, child support, and their job is in the weeds if they go against the establishment, most people, or I should say the cowards, will not. And because they will not, that's how come the system keeps going on and on in the same manner as it does. But I will tell you, I know this for a fact. The New York State Police, though not perfect, will not tolerate that whatsoever, but then there's different layers. And the thing that people are not talking about, there's 2 other police officers that are out there. And I suspect, and it hasn't come out yet, that one, I know it was a task force because it was multiple agencies that were involved. And how the body camera works in some situations is when you become in a certain proximity of one other body camera, it clicks on. So I'm wondering, they didn't realize that camera was on. So, or at some point they didn't realize. Regardless, their actions were unjustified. The institution of policing for years has been broken and dysfunctional. I do believe each year, each incident, things change and try to get better. I just think the messaging of defunding the police has impacted us tremendously in the sense that us as Black males do not trust the police system and don't trust as far as being part of it. But we have to change that. We have to have solid individuals like Chief Frank Fowler to be reincarnated within police agencies. Chief Duvall from Syracuse, reincarnated in police agencies. People who have stood at the door, DeLacy Davis from around the country, other national, Rochelle Bilal out of Philadelphia, sheriff, other prominent, Chuck Wilson, prominent individuals that are willing to fight for the cause. For our community, each church in Syracuse should raise up and present a police officer to be their stalwart within the agency. And when we start doing that, you create change, because those that have grown up in the church, those that are presented from within the community, will act in the best interest of the community and cannot be wavered, because one, they will be brought up that way. Two, they know they have the churches they're backing. And until we change the mindset that we do not want to be part of policing, which is pretty good income, pretty good way to create change. The institution, as you talk about, Dr. Johnson, will always stay the same. And no matter how much we take away immunity from them, until we start raising up police officers and putting them into the police agencies with the backing of the churches and the community leaders, we're going to have these problems.
So I would like to say this also on this point, and that is, let's be really clear that, while we're, talking about the aspects of Black communities and, officers who are Black, and, what particular, responses or reactions we have to that. Let's be very clear that we, also must be focusing on the entire society. Now, the reason why this can persist is because beyond the Black community, where there is, no sense of urgency, or compunction, to have something done about these circumstances, is the reason why these things can go on. And so when the rest of the society says that this can no longer be tolerated, then we will see action, legislative action. We will see things happen differently in the courts. We will see things happen differently in the police departments. But to the extent that the larger society, which is a majority white society, a population, says that, we cannot have these things done in our names either. These are public agencies. These are public servants. These folks are supposed to act on behalf of the benefit of all of us. And so while a disproportionate number of us are being victimized in this way, unless and until everybody says this is not what we expect and will tolerate and will co-sign on with respect to policing in our society, these things are going to go on. So these demands for getting the George Floyd Act off of the desks, out of committees in Congress, and get to the president's desk for a signature, that has to be something that everybody lobbies for or petitions their elected representatives to do, in the House, in the Senate, to make sure that that sort of thing happens. But as long as we are so stratified as a society, racially and economically, and in all the ways in which we are, when we don't see the humanity in each other beyond race and all of our characteristics, that is why this sort of thing can go on.
Right. And we have to be honest. We talk about law enforcement, we talk about government, political elected officials. Our communities need to take responsibility too, because we're Martin Luther King Day this year, we lose 11-year-old in the community on MLK Boulevard in Syracuse. This Black on Black crime in which we're killing each other. And I heard, I believe it was Minister Farrakhan on a Zoom not too long ago, and his commentary was, we killing each other day to day, and there's no marching, there's no outcry. And matter of fact, there's no urgency to give up the individuals that are committing these crimes, making it even harder on the police department, and giving no excuses again, but making it easier for us to be desensitized towards things that occur in the communities. So with that being said, the communities are here. policing, is there an issue? Yes. As far as the community also, look, we need to take accountability because we're killing each other at a disproportionate number. We talk about chokeholds. I talk about Eric Garner. I've been involved in a lot of different conversations. Another nonviolent crime in which a man lost his life for due to a chokehold. So those things need to get better in the police department. Though we need our political officials to move legislation faster and forward, we have no room for bad legislation that is being put forth.
But let me ask you this. Thank you for that. This idea of the black on black crime, and I know that riles people up a lot when you put this and that together. So I just got to raise that. But I think the other thing is in terms of victims who happen to be black. And one thing that came up that I also want you to address is this idea of resistance, right? The narrative is, well, he ran and he resisted, right? And then I go back to January 6th, 2021, when we saw what happened when those folks were all up in the Capitol and not one, well, a couple of people did lose their lives, but I'm just saying to you, there seems to be a different standard about what happens to you if you're in fear of your life, trying to run home and get home, as opposed to when you're black and that happens. And so, Professor Johnson, this black, go ahead, Eliot.
Look, the terminology of resisting, the terminology of failing to comply have gone from, actual real act to an excuse to lay. And I tell the community, I tell young adults, if it's a vehicle on traffic stop, take the ticket and live to fight another day. At the end of the day, you're going to pay a fine. But to get to the serious point, I believe your question is, has it become an excuse to lay hands on people unnecessarily or in an excessive manner? It has. Failure to comply. Look, cops and robbers have been something for years, going back to Roadrunner. You do something, you chase them down, and then you put them in cuffs. That's what you get paid to do. You don't chase them down to put them in a body bag. And unfortunately, the mindset of failing to comply has become, unfortunately, the end result is death. So I will tell young adults, and this is a message you need to hear really clear. If the police officer starts the conversation out and it's bad in the beginning, it's probably not going to get better. Don't allow it to escalate. If they are trying to put you in handcuffs and they're saying that you're resisting, do everything you can do to comply, because you're resisting is code word for basically being able to do whatever they want to do to you. Is it all police? We have to make it clear. No. But failing to comply is the gateway to being able to lay hands on you. The question is, you don't know how they're going to lay hands on you.
And just to get to that answer from the question from earlier, and Professor Johnson, you can respond to that, to what Eliot just said, this idea of how black officers are chosen. Are they chosen to conform to the status quo of the beliefs within the ranks of law enforcement versus challenging the system? Are they selected because they feel like they're going to be one of us?
Well, so the short answer is yes, and it's also no. I think that on some level, maybe a superficial level, the idea of diversity within the ranks is to bring in multiple perspectives into policing. People who are connected with the different communities, so they can bring a different way of viewing and acting with respect to the communities. And I think that they're in some settings, I think that is genuinely something that is desired. But I think that there is something that is overriding and very difficult to combat, and that is the culture that is inculcated within the institution of policing that everyone must ascribe to if they are going to be effective in working and get promoted and do the sorts of things that are expected of them within that employment setting. So I think that it really, it does come down to at least two aspects of that. Wanting to get different people of different backgrounds in policing, but not necessarily wanting the culture of policing itself to change. And so that becomes a real, the catch-22 for people who want to go into the system to change it, when they are met with resistance within a system. As Trooper Eliot said, Trooper Boyce said that this is a long-standing institution, and it is moving at a snail's pace to change it. And so it's not that there isn't change. The question is whether or not it's the kind of change that needs to happen. And I'll say one other thing about that, and that is, by and large, the requirements, for employment as police officers, doesn't, it isn't very exacting in terms of, having to have advanced degrees or college or community college, a higher, training and experience and educational background coming in to the police force. And the United States is fairly unique in that respect, in not having those kinds of educational demands. And so I know that, Trooper Boyce talked about this a few moments ago in terms of the trauma, different types of things that, officers themselves might or might not be equipped to do. And so we really do have to have a better way of determining who gets onto these forces. What are their backgrounds? Do they have experience with different communities or not? If they don't, what is their training so that they are able to have a better understanding, a better way of interacting with people? If they're coming from backgrounds where they haven't had any informal or formal, for that matter, interaction with people from different communities, other than their own, how do we expect them to communicate with people?
Right.
With all of the other images, that we have about Black folks and brown people, give us that sense of all of the stereotypes about us. What would disabuse an officer coming from a background where there isn't something that would counteract that from acting any differently? So we really have to understand that. And if I can say real quickly too, on this point about the running, there have been, there have been cases looking at this very issue, where the question of, why someone might run, particularly, Black, man, might run from police. And, I practiced and teach, in this area. And, it has come to be recognized by some courts now that running in and of itself is not a basis to find that someone is guilty or even probable cause for finding of a basis for stopping someone. So you have to look at the entire circumstances as to why somebody might run from police. What's the history of the relationship with law enforcement in their community, such that they might not want to be stopped in a particular place? As I understand it, Mr. Nichols was just thousands of feet away from his home.
Less than that. Yeah.
I beg your pardon?
No, less than that.
Yes, less, right? So he's calling his mother, I think, out of a real, out of anguish and wanting her, but also hoping that she will hear what's going on with him out there on the street, that somebody will come. Right. And so he's running to get to a place of safety. Imagine that. He's running to get to a place of safety from people who are supposed to keep us safe. He's got to run from the police because we see what happened to him. Now, the other thing is that I suppose, ironically enough, the Supreme Court case that tells us how we determine whether or not there's excessive force or not and what the limitations of that are comes out of Tennessee. It's a Memphis case, a case called Tennessee versus Garner, right? Where the police shoot this 15-year-old who's accused of a house burglary, right? He's got a wallet. I think it had about $10 in it, right? He's climbing a fence. The officer shoots him in the back of the head. The Supreme Court says if you don't have any reason to believe that someone who, and it's a young Black man, young Black youth, right? If you don't have a reason to believe that the officer's safety is in jeopardy or other members of the community are in danger, you cannot use lethal force in that circumstance. And the officer in that situation testified that he was sure that this young boy who was running, and I say young boy because he was 15 years old, climbing a fence. The officer said he had no reason to believe that he was armed, but he was shot in the back of the head, dead. That, by definition, was excessive force. And so here we are in Memphis again, looking at an example or an exercise of excessive force on a Black body where it was absolutely unnecessary.
Yeah, their actions would have been unnecessary regardless of color.
It's true.
It's ridiculous. But just to get back to the piece about the recruitment process,
Mm-hmm.
You got to understand law enforcement is a paramilitary organization at all times. Because it's paramilitary, it requires order. But what you said, Doc, is very, Doc Johnson, is very important. I think in order to get a better police, I did 35 years in law enforcement. Life experience, and I started at 21. I wasn't ready at 21. I had to manage my way through till I got a little older, a little more mature. All right. But life experiences really have to get more value than education. I know a lot of educated people still live in the basement of their mama house, right? Or at a house, right? So life experience, unfortunately, a lot of times how we turn to that for change and it continues on the same path is utilize the individuals that come out of the military, right? But now you come in with the military mindset of operating in that fashion, and that doesn't always improve us. It gives you a structured, more life experience individual. But when it comes to African Americans and Black and brown people, what happens, our life experiences that may have us caught up in something minor, like back in the day, maybe a marijuana charge, is amplified to the point where, you don't get in. But that individual who may have had some improprieties is a person that's lived a little bit, have life experiences. So when they deal with someone in the streets or they deal with someone in the community, they understand. So I think what the question or the person that asked the question was saying, those are the individuals that just getting disqualified. And I concur 100%. There has to be some latitude. And I know within, and because I know the state police well, I know there are those individuals, because I sat on these panels, that may have had some questions and they go to review. And when they go to review, they sit down and discuss it and then they get in. Where maybe some 20 years ago it was, you got this, you're done. But better police agencies require diversity. And though a lot of people don't like the curse word of diversity, or they don't like the curse word of saying Black or white in any conversation, until we could have real conversations about Black and white openly in law enforcement, there's going to be a slow pace of change. And I have to give a shout out to a Syracuse individual. His name was Sergeant Chuck Jones. Zone Sergeant Jones. He was an individual where when something happened in the community or something happened nationally, we would sit in the squad room and we would talk about it. Black, white, whoever was there, lieutenant, captains, and we have conversations. People have an opportunity to express themselves, what they thought, how they felt, and it made us all better.
As opposed to sitting in the squad room reinforcing the status quo that It's not our community, that's those folks over there, and it's not happening here, as opposed to that, because that's what you see a lot of. And by the way, I've gotten word that there's an incident that happened right here in this community. I don't have the facts. I can't speak on it yet, but in the next few days, we may hear of an incident that happened right here in our community. That being said, I really appreciate what you said about Chuck Jones, but a lot of, I hope that becomes more of a standard, because instead of saying that's not us, we wouldn't be that way. We've got, you know what I mean? Instead of really opening up the conversation. Go ahead.
Even worse, George, what happens is everyone creates a side. And when you
Yeah.
create a side, you start
Yeah.
talking about things in a vacuum.
Right.
So that the black officers are having a conversation, the white officers are having a conversation, the female officers are having a conversation.
Yes.
The second one from one entity walks in the room, you hush up. Well, if you could say to the other officers that I'm going to be working with, you should be able to say it in front of me, right?
Yeah.
So if that line of communication doesn't open and doesn't remain open for open dialogue, and it's tough to have these conversations because people come from different backgrounds, different perspectives. But at the end of the day, your responsibility as a police officer is to serve with dignity, good character, and in the best interest of the community and safely.
And it comes down to the leadership. And so you talked about that in the Tyre Nichols case. You've got the police chief who's saying, this is not the kind of department that I'm going to lead, and I'm going to move swiftly to make sure that in this community that we will not stand for that. And that was swift. And we hope and we hope that will be, again, this is what Tyre Nichols' parents said, his father particularly, right? And Attorney Ben Crump, both of them said, now we know that it's possible. Don't tell me about we need to see this or we need to see that. We know what's possible when it comes to justice for victims like Tyre Nichols.
And George, the thing is that it has always been possible. In fact, it has always been required. The fact of the matter is it has not occurred. And just to go back to something that we were talking about earlier, when we tend to see it, it will also be because those accused or defendants will likely be people of color. So these officers, and I take nothing away from the police chief in Memphis. I've watched the interviews with her, and I think she did act in a very swift manner, swift justice. But I think it's important for us to understand that there is a larger lens through which we need to look at this.
Come on.
And that is, I want us to open up the aperture so that we see not only the micro aspect of it, but also the macro aspect, so that it doesn't depend on whether or not you have a Black woman who's a police chief or not for all the change that she is bringing about to that department. You shouldn't have to be in her jurisdiction for you to get fairness when you come into contact with police officers. And I think we need to understand, just back to this point about recruitment or who comes on board, we really need to know who are the recruits and what are their motivations, and if they get on the force, what kind of continual training happens for them. It was so clear to me, even before watching the videos, just from as much as I could glean from what I was reading about the situation. The officers were just angry. They were angry because their authority had been challenged. When the first videos, just snippets of the video started to come out, and it was, I guess, in the immediate aftermath of the stop, and you could hear the officers. They were breathing heavily. They were angry that they had to chase this man. They were pissed off about that. I mean, that was just so clear. This challenge to their authority and control. And, you know, we saw that too, right? We saw that in the Sandra Bland case. She asked that officer, why am I being stopped?
Why am I being stopped?
He said, I don't have to tell you. Well, first of all, that's just wrong.
Yeah.
Of course he had to tell her. But that situation escalated because he didn't think he had to be responsive to her, only that she had to be compliant and responsive to him. And so these things about, you know, these aspects of, you know, personality, where people want to exercise some sort of control over other people, whether it's in a law enforcement context that's legitimate or not, truly has to be examined by the members of the force.
It has to be checked. And, you know, we talk about police and we talk about from, you know, top down, you know, and when you talk about the top down perspective, is the chief can't be everywhere and see everything. It has to be a bottom up approach. And that's why I highlighted Sergeant Jones, his impact, because when you have line sergeants and you have solid police officers that are standing in the gap in the community, regardless of color, regardless of gender, and they're doing the right thing, that's never going to happen. I also would contend that it usually takes some years to get on the task force. And that's what it was. That was a task force. Each one of these 5 had less than 6 years on the job. So far as experience and interaction.
On that specialized unit you're talking about?
Yes, when that's the 5 individuals that were arrested, I think the guy had the most amount of time, had 6 years on.
6 years.
So, you know, lack of experience, you know, you don't get into your stride in law enforcement, understanding where you're going to be, how you're going to perform until you get like 5+ years on. You know, in many cases, some people mature faster than that, but that's a sign that, you know, lack of wanting to be in it, you know, on those task force, but not enough time. It's just my humble opinion. I think most police officers will tell you, you know, there's some police officers that can function that way. I think also task force are very good in many cases, then very bad, because if you're in the task force with all individuals from your agency, you act one way. You're in the agency with other people, you know, they're alpha males, you know, and these alpha males, someone wants to show some degree of dominance and who's going to be the most dominant person. Until you get that one, like, there should have been a police officer that showed up and they should have been like, yo, Eliot's here. There ain't no way in the heck he going to let this happen. He wouldn't have had to say anything.
Right.
This is over. And you need to breed that mindset, and that's how that stops. I wish you would, if, you know, like a Chief Fowler or Eliot Boyce was on the scene.
You said that, and Professor Johnson get in here too, but you said that the police need to have conversations, and until we're willing to have those conversations. If the leadership, you know, so you have, you know, Chief Davis out of Memphis, who said, you know, I was horrified by this, or whatever she said related to this video. But if the leadership isn't involved, who's going to have those conversations? If the leadership is part of the status quo problem in law enforcement, I'm saying if they're not willing to force these conversations to happen, because for some officers, they don't want to have them, right? So if they're not, how do you suggest that these conversations happen if you don't have a leadership that is committed, that wants to see the change, feels put upon? Because obviously the George Floyd and the reaction to police has created a real defense, right, within the ranks. So how do those conversations happen in this environment?
Look, all change starts with the community. Right?
So we can force the change. Okay.
Yeah,
so it's on us. Okay.
Yeah. It's not on you. It's definitely on the hierarchy in the police agencies.
Right.
But police officers and police chiefs are basically put in place by political elected officials, which comes from the power of our long-standing churches. But what I will say, a lot of the organizations that have had dramatic impact on law enforcement are fading away. There's no replenishing. We have the same individuals running the NAACP, running the urban leagues. There's no desire to bring on younger, more vocal, because we don't want the young vocal people in there. So we need to make sure our community bases are in place. So when we start raising up or they start putting forth a chief that we know is not going to be in the best interest of the community can stop that. They could have an impact on it. But until that time, police officers and policing are victims of their own success. And what I mean by that, we have Black officers, I will go to them, who no longer will join Black organizations. Camp 415, right? Central New York Association Minority Police, 415 represented the Sheila Wally Howard. The organization fades because Black officers, I don't want to be part of the Black organization. I've been part of every Black organization in the country because it's my responsibility to give back to the community, because the community is what got me here. Until we get young officers to understand that their ability to improve policing comes with a baseline of supporting the community, we may continue this trend, and even when we have trends, when we have solid police chiefs, period, regardless of color, it's just, something that's new to have Black females running organizations, or solid sisters who basically come in and say, listen, I'm not having that. They're getting arrested immediately. They still need the support of the community. And I will say this too, because I'm hearing her being ridiculed for her decision to arrest them swiftly. Because now on one side, she's doing the right thing. And then we have people from the community saying, well, if they were white, would she have done that? If they were all females, would she have done that? Regardless of what your opinion is, she did the right thing. That's the only thing shouldn't matter, but it's not. So she has to answer questions. Police chiefs around the country who will follow this blueprint will have to answer questions. Understand, we can't have it both ways. These individuals needed to be arrested swiftly before there's any public outrage, and it was done. So now the question will be, I don't see anyone tearing up the streets now.
But it's very interesting. We have not heard from the union, and which, what's their position on the? At least I haven't seen a position. And so
I did see a statement from the union. I haven't seen very much, and it was it may have been an excerpt of something that I saw in one of the papers that I read. But I will say that my impression of the statement was not a like a rousing defense of the officers. It was much more muted in terms of saying that they hope for justice as well in this case. So it's very interesting to me. Whereas in other instances, usually the union, statements are unequivocal in terms of their support for officers. So I found it, quite interesting that it didn't come out that way, that they were calling, they expressed their condolences to the family and also called for justice. So I think that was an interesting posture that at least the statement that I saw made. I think you do have to have it both ways. I commend the chief in Memphis for her swift action. But I think that we will know when things are different, when we see that these kinds of things happen, swift dismissals and swift justice, when in fact the racial backgrounds of the officers are across the board. That they aren't people of color who are quickly coming before the criminal justice system, because we know that much of this brutality is not committed by officers of color. And so when other officers are not treated similarly, the swiftness doesn't happen, that's what gives it the sort of, skepticism about the system itself. And so I think it really does have to be both and not either or. And that is why I keep talking about the systemic nature of all of this.
Yeah. Yes, and we also have to make sure we add the caveat, though they don't carry all the blame, or the majority of it is media. The media hype in many cases, though justified in some cases, definitely fuel additional fire. But also the culture of law enforcement creates an environment in which, look, whoever is the dominant culture within that agency will dictate how things happen and how people respond. In many cases, nepotism, which is something, is starting to happen in the sense of, we have generations of, Black officers having their kids become part of the police agencies. But in many cases, look, somewhere, somehow, someone may be related. Is that always the case? No. But are they on the same bowling league? Are they the same poker team? So it's harder to condemn your friend, or it's easier to support them from a stance of maybe being a union member or being a high-ranking official in the agency. At the end of the day, bad police officers, regardless of your relationship or connection to them, need to be gone. They make it harder for all officers. And unfortunately, in these many cases, they make it hard for good white officers. And I know everyone cringes when you say white, but white males dominate the system. White males in many cases are the individuals that are in hierarchy, high positions. Unfortunately, some are connected to the community, some are not. But there has to be, my thought was, in order to get promoted in any agency, you should be able to have a strong connection with all the diverse organizations within your community. And people say, what does that do? You get a better understanding if you're a member of the NAACP and you're going to the meetings and you're having balanced discussion. If you're a member of the Urban League and you're going in and you're not from that community, but you engage and have a relationship with organizations, that makes it better. And will make you, as a commissioned officer, because see, if you don't break the cycle of being connected to the community, it starts with becoming a patrol officer, becomes a sergeant. And if that sergeant becomes connected to the community, he has a better understanding when he moves up to become a lieutenant and he becomes a captain. And if he stays connected. If you're driving into the area, this urban environment, and you come from a suburb and you bring your suburb ways into that community, you'll never spend time understanding what it's like to be part of that community. And that becomes a disconnect. Then you become the sergeant, the lieutenant, the captain, and move on up with no connection to the community. So you'll never understand when someone walks in and says, well, this happened. To you, you analyze it from the suburbs instead of analyzing it from the community. That's how you create change. So make sure they're invested in the community. I think we move that snail a little faster as far as change, or at least the manner in which we treat or our community is being treated. And the thing we can't get disconnected on, there's a lot of people saying things only Black people in the hood. There's some, Caucasian folks there too. And, so they deal with the same issues, though I get it. African Americans are the ones in many cases that get the brunt of this type of behavior, or at least get the spotlight for it.
Yeah.
You have a white officer be the Black male is going to sell newspapers for weeks, and that's something that we also have to be able to control the narrative of stuff like that. But for the most part, we need to make sure police officers, particularly supervisors, are connected to the community as a mandate. And if we can mandate that, at least they'll have a better, they can't basically say, I didn't know, because you still have white officers referring to Black males as boy. And I'm like, yo, bro, that's not cool. And some of them, you say it to them, they go, I didn't know, so you educate them on it. But if they're part of the community, it changed.
Final thoughts, Professor Johnson, which I know we had a time commitment, but we in the conversation in real time. This is live, Sunday, January the 29th. Yeah. So let's go.
Yeah. So I do think that this is a structural issue. I think we have to deal with it as such. I think we have to deal with it on every single level. But we can't ignore the fact that there are entrenched biases within the system, and that includes racial hierarchy. And I think until we begin to dismantle that kind of thinking and those hierarchical ways of looking at race and people of color within the system, that we will continue to see more of this particular type of violence. I also think that it is critical that the entire society see this as something that is important to all of us, where it's where it's seen that Black and brown people's lives are expendable, not just because they are killed by law enforcement members, but because of the mass incarceration of Black and brown people, where that is seen as something that is acceptable within the society. We don't look for alternatives within all of our societal institutions and structures, then these kinds of things are going to persist. And so we all have the right, and I would say the obligation, to petition our government, and that is to say, to make these sentiments known to elected officials, that we want changes made on every single level within these law enforcement institutions, and indeed across the criminal justice system in its entirety. And then we may begin to see some differences, because everyone will be invested in the fairness and equality and equity that is supposed to be the hallmark of the United States system of justice.
Our demands must be clear, our demands must be known, and our demands must be persistent if we want change to occur. That, the voice of Professor Paula Johnson, you just heard, a professor of law at Syracuse University, and many other things, co-director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative and the co-founder of the Cold Case Justice Center, and also a fellow, I got it right here. Let me just give this proper honorific, and newly appointed to the Franklin H. Williams Judicial Commission of New York State.
So George, not so new anymore. I've been there. I guess I'll have to update that.
Update that, but it's been a minute. Okay.
Been serving for a while now, not so new, and I direct the Cold Case Justice Initiative. So
Director Cold
I
Case Justice Initiative.
Being here with both of you. I appreciate this discussion, and I hope that we have more of it. I look forward to more interactions and discussion with the with the audience as well.
We appreciate you, Professor Johnson, director of the Cold Case Justice Initiative. Thank you for correcting. And Eliot Boyce, of course, is a retired state trooper from the New York State Police. Eliot, thank you.
Thank you, George. As always, it's been a pleasure. I concur with the director. There's got to be change in the institution. And we have to be careful on bad policies that basically created gateways to putting African Americans back in jail. And I know, George, you know my passion. This is menthol ban that's looming over us in New York and New York State. We're legalizing marijuana with flavors of Kool-Aid and all these things for our young adults that are pretty much smoking marijuana at a disproportionate number. But meanwhile, now the governor's putting out a proposal that she's going to ban menthol cigarettes and vape under the guideline that it's going to be in the best interest of the African American community. It's just going to be one more tool. When you ban menthols, you ban anything, it makes it illegal. And when it becomes illegal, it basically becomes a gateway for interaction with law enforcement. You take marijuana out and you put ban on menthol cigarettes in. We are down on a slippery slope. It's just going to be a means for people trafficking and smuggling. And, look, Eric Garner lost his life over, allegedly selling Lucy cigarettes, and he was choked out. We need to be conscious on what we're pushing through. But as far as change in law enforcement agencies, we need it institutionally, but we darn sure don't need to be giving them any other reasons for unnecessary interactions. The number of African Americans that are dying at the hands of police officers are not due to violent crimes. It's a result of nonviolent crimes like vehicle and traffic stops. We need to get that under wraps, and we can't give anyone, any law enforcement officers, the bad ones, any other reasons to encounter young Americans. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And I look forward to possibly one day having one of these live, because I really would like to
This is live, brother.
When I say live, I'm talking about in person.
In person, okay.
where you could just hear,
all right,
their sentiments and see it, because I think that will go a long way also.
We'll work on that. We'll work on that. Eliot Boyce and Professor Paula Johnson, Director of the Cold Case Justice
Thank you.
Initiative and the Professor of Law at Syracuse University. Thank you both.
Yes,
you.
thank you so much.